In a lab at the University of Tübingen in Germany, researchers spent more than a year training 3 carrion crows to do something no animal outside of humans had ever been documented doing before, controlling the exact number of sounds they made with their voice on purpose to communicate a specific quantity. The results, published in the journal Science in 2025, describe crows essentially counting out loud, the same basic strategy a toddler uses before they've learned actual number words, saying 111 instead of 3 when pointing at a group of objects, matching the number of sounds they make to the number of things they're describing rather than using an abstract symbol for the quantity itself. It's a small, specific finding, but it points at something much bigger about how sophisticated crow vocal control actually is, and it's part of a wave of real research over just the past year or two that's been steadily rewriting what scientists thought they understood about how these birds use their voices. The study was led by Diana Liao, a neurobiologist at the University of Tübingen who had previously shown that crows can judge relative quantities using their calls, essentially communicating more or fewer in a general sense. Her follow-up question was more specific and considerably harder to test, whether crows could go beyond a vague sense of more or fewer, and actually produce a controlled, exact number of vocalizations on command, matching a specific target quantity rather than just a rough estimate. To test this, her team trained the 3 crows over more than a year, showing them a number from 1 to 4 displayed on a screen, alongside a matching number of tones played through a speaker, then rewarding the birds with mealworms and food pellets for producing the correct number of caws in response, followed by pecking a touchscreen circle functioning essentially as an enter key to signal they were finished with that specific sequence. What the crows demonstrated wasn't simple rote memorization of a trained response. The birds had to actively plan the entire vocal sequence before making their first sound, meaning the decision about how many caws to produce was locked in mentally before the first caw ever left their beak. The same cognitive planning process a young child goes through internally before they start counting out loud. Researchers were also able to distinguish, based on subtle acoustic and timing differences in how the crows vocalized, between calls the birds produced as a controlled, deliberate response to the counting task versus calls made spontaneously outside the experimental context, showing that this wasn't simply the crows making noise and researchers imposing meaning onto it after the fact, but a genuine, intentional, controlled behavior specific to the counting task itself. Liao has described this ability as a possible evolutionary precursor to the kind of symbolic counting that, as far as current science understands, only humans actually developed further into full abstract number systems, language, and written mathematics. This counting research connects to a broader, genuinely active area of current crow science looking specifically at the internal structure of their vocal sequences, not just individual calls in isolation, but how crows string multiple sounds together and whether that stringing together follows any kind of rule-based pattern. In 2025, researchers Claudia Washer and Sean Youngblood published the first documented evidence that corvid vocal sequences follow something called Menzerath's law, a well-established linguistic principle originally identified in human language, where longer sequences tend to be made up of shorter individual components. The same reason longer sentences in human speech tend to be built from shorter words, and longer words tend to be built from shorter syllables, an efficiency pattern that helps keep communication manageable, even as the amount of information being conveyed increases. Studying carrion crows, hooded crows, and hybrid individuals between the 2 subspecies, the research team found that crow call sequences follow the same basic structural principle, with the effect showing up more strongly in females and in younger individuals, suggesting real, measurable individual variation in how efficiently different crows structure their own vocal output. Professor Claudia Washer, who studies behavioral biology at Anglia Ruskin University, has pointed out that this kind of structural patterning is a well-documented, systematically studied feature of human language, and its presence in crow calls suggests their vocal system is organized specifically to minimize wasted effort while still preserving the actual communicative content being passed along, a level of structural sophistication nobody had systematically documented in crow vocalizations before. The deeper, still not fully answered question sitting behind both of these findings is whether crows are capable of what linguists call compositional syntax, meaning combining individual, separately meaningful sounds together to build new, more complex meanings. The same basic principle that lets human language take a finite set of words and generate an effectively infinite number of distinct sentences. This isn't a hypothetical question researchers are just now starting to ask about birds generally. A well-known 2016 study of Japanese great tits, a much smaller and less famously intelligent songbird, demonstrated genuine compositional syntax in the wild, showing that the birds combine a specific sequence of alarm notes, meaning roughly scan for danger, with a separate call, meaning roughly approach the caller, and that when strung together in the correct order, The combined call produces a genuine compound meaning, get alert and come here, that's fundamentally different from and more complex than either individual call component on its own, and crucially, that the combined meaning disappears entirely if you play the same two calls back to the birds in reverse order. Proving the sequence itself, not just the individual sounds, is what's actually carrying the meaning. Whether crows, with their considerably larger and more flexible vocal repertoire, are doing something similarly compositional with their own calls, is exactly the kind of question the current wave of AI-assisted acoustic research, including large-scale machine learning clustering projects presented at engineering conferences like ICASP in 2026, specifically aimed at automatically sorting raw, unlabeled crow audio into meaningful categories, is actively working to answer, though a confirmed published answer isn't sitting in the scientific literature yet. Separately from anything involving sound, a genuinely unexpected 2026 study led by Jessica Yorzinski at Texas A&M University and Ann Clark at Binghamton University tackled a completely different long-standing puzzle about crow communication, this one visual rather than vocal. Crows live in remarkably complex social groups, recognizing individual faces, defending specific territories, holding long grudges against particular people, and maintaining extended, multi-generational family relationships. All forms of social complexity that, in most other animals, tend to be supported by visible, distinguishing physical signals individuals can use to tell each other apart. Crows, though, look to human eyes almost uniformly, featurelessly black, which raised a real scientific question researchers had puzzled over for years. How does a bird with what looks like zero visible individual variation manage to run such a socially sophisticated system? The new research suggests part of the answer is that crows aren't actually as visually uniform as human eyes perceive them to be, and that a significant amount of information may be encoded directly in their feathers through ultraviolet reflectance patterns, subtle differences in how their black feathers reflect ultraviolet light, entirely invisible to human vision, but very likely visible to crows themselves, since many bird species, unlike humans, have a fourth type of color, sensing cone in their eyes specifically tuned to detect ultraviolet wavelengths. The study, specifically, found that these ultraviolet patterns appear to correlate with individual age, suggesting crows may be able to visually read information about who they're looking at, potentially including how old that specific individual is, using a communication channel that has been sitting directly in front of human researchers. And every casual observer, for as long as anyone has been watching these birds, simply invisible to us the entire time. All of this recent research builds on top of an already well-established foundation of crow cognitive science that continues to genuinely surprise researchers studying it. A 2020 study demonstrated, for what researchers describe as the first time in a non-primate, non-human species, that carrion crows show evidence of what's called sensory consciousness, meaning a measurable, testable, subjective awareness of their own sensory experience, a level of self-referential cognitive processing previously assumed to be essentially limited to humans and our closest primate relatives. Longer-running work led by John Marsluff at the University of Washington, using a genuinely clever, experimental design involving distinctive rubber masks worn by researchers who trapped and banded wild crows, has documented that crows remember a specific human face associated with a negative encounter for at least 2.7 years in controlled, peer-reviewed studies, and that this recognition and the accompanying scolding behavior spread socially to other crows in the surrounding area who never personally witnessed the original trapping event at all, essentially a form of cultural transmission of specific, individual-level social information passed from bird to bird. Cambridge researcher Claudia Washer has also pointed to broader comparative work showing that vocal mimicry, the ability to imitate other sounds, shows up in roughly 30% of studied corvid species, with individual birds documented imitating anywhere from a single external sound up to more than 70 distinct sounds, including calls from entirely different bird species, other predator calls, and, in some well-documented cases, human speech itself. It's worth being honest about the state of the broader field here, too, because even with all of this genuinely remarkable research accumulating quickly, a 2025 systematic review published in the journal Animal Behavior pointed out something important about how uneven our actual scientific understanding of corvid vocal communication still is. Looking at studies published between 1965 and 2022, the review found that out of the roughly 128 recognized corvid species worldwide, only about 27% have been studied with any real depth specifically regarding their vocal communication, with the bulk of existing research concentrated heavily on just a small handful of well-known species, American crows, common ravens, and Eurasian magpies in particular, leaving huge, genuine knowledge gaps across the majority of corvid species that remain essentially unstudied on this specific question. That's an important, honest, Caveat for understanding where this field actually stands: a lot of genuinely exciting, well-documented findings concentrated in a small number of intensively studied species. Sitting alongside a much larger number of related species, scientists simply haven't had the research resources to properly investigate yet. What all of this actually adds up to, taken together rather than as a single dramatic headline, is a genuinely fast-moving, legitimately exciting area of active science. Crows demonstrating deliberate, planned control over the exact number of sounds they produce, structuring their longer call sequences according to an efficiency principle borrowed directly from the study of human language, very possibly carrying individual identifying information in an ultraviolet visual channel invisible to human eyes, and doing all of this while researchers using new machine learning tools are actively working to determine whether these birds are combining individual calls to build genuinely new, more complex meanings. The same basic structural trick that gives human language its power. None of it is unsettling. It's the opposite of unsettling, a small, familiar, common bird most people walk past in a parking lot without a second thought, turning out to be running a far more sophisticated communication and social system than almost anyone assumed, hiding in plain sight, right up until researchers finally had the patient, careful tools needed to notice.